is the Prevalent Risk Governance podcast, featuring conversations with today's top C-suite executives and practitioners who not only look at third-party risk governance, but push through the boundaries to protect data. Now, here's Prevalent CEO Jonathan Dembrot and third-party evangelist Brenda Ferraro.
This week, Jonathan and I are excited to welcome Aetna Vice President and Chief Security Officer Jim Routh to the Prevalent Risk Governance podcast. Many of you out there know Jim Routh as one of the greatest presenters of all time. He has a way of telling a story, and he's one of the greatest presenters because of the fact that he can educate you with his keen ability to influence. Jim is a published and well-renowned chief security officer, and he's spent many of his years of his career paving the way towards building a top-notch global security protection program. In our candid interview, we will hear about what is publicly realized as the top risk and how to move from compliance-based assessments to clearly understanding and proactively managing our risk landscape.
Jim, thanks so much for being here for our first episode of the Prevalent Risk Governance podcast. Really excited to have you here. Wanted to just get this open and start talking about third-party risk and risk management generally. What is your top risk related to third parties?
So today our top risk, first of all, third parties have been historically a top risk for our enterprise for quite some time, for at least the last year and a half. And that's largely because of the size and the scope, but it's also relative to, in healthcare, the attack surface is exponentially greater than other industries, largely due to the sensitivity of the information that's shared. It's patient information that's shared. And the way to identify that patient information across intermediaries is largely Social Security number, which is the most marketable asset in the dark web for of any demographic information that's available. So the combination of that makes it a significant challenge, because if you think of the delivery of healthcare from your own experiences, there are a lot of players. So you go to the doctor says, oh, you need a test. And you go to a diagnostic testing provider, and the doctor and the diagnostic testing provider are sharing information about you in terms of the test results. Of course, you get access to that, in most cases. So now we have a three-way. And of course, if there's a specialist or if there's physical therapy, now we have another intermediary. These are all small businesses that work towards providing a quality healthcare outcome, but aren't necessarily in tune with understanding how to protect the data that they're handling every day. And that in of itself is where the challenge is. So today, we think of large organizations migrating to cloud computing, specifically using cloud infrastructures of service. And that's certainly prevalent, no pun intended, in the industry. And more companies are taking advantage of that, largely because the economics are somewhat intoxicating. So there's a compelling reason. Well, the same thing's happening with the smaller entities as well. So the broker that sells healthcare insurance to small to medium-sized businesses has all of the application information backed up on their hard drives on their workstations back in the office, and they'll want to back that up in the cloud, figuring it's more cost effective than maintaining it on hard drives, and in some cases thinking that they'll improve security by doing that. So they'll go to AWS, order an S3 bucket, move it down there. Of course, the broker, Vinny, is thinking in his own mind, this will help me spend more time on the golf course cutting deals with my clients, while Tina, who's the office manager, is thinking, well, Vinny's going to want access to this information, so maybe I should take authentication off because this URL is hard to find and nobody's ever going to find it, and who cares about our data anywhere? And that in of itself causes misconfiguration that exposes could be hundreds of thousands of records of individuals and their health information or their demographic information, all of which creates a major breach that Vinny and Tina aren't ready to deal with. And from an enterprise perspective, I have to educate Vinny and Tina on how to do configuration management of cloud infrastructure effectively. So The latest risk that I'm concerned about is all of the Vinnies and Tinas using infrastructure as a service without configuring it properly and not providing authentication, not encrypting the data, and basically thinking of it just for convenience. Now, how do we govern that at the enterprise level? Well, I'll let you know because we're figuring that out right now.
Well, we've talked a little bit about this, and I've heard you speak about this exponential growth in the past, and it's absolutely the case. We're seeing this. I think the other thing that we're thinking about also is that there's asymmetries in the both investment as well as the losses. So if you have and manage your own controls, right, you can invest in them, you get a certain return. But look at Petya, right? Petya really hit the healthcare community pretty hard. Small third party. Nobody was really covering the third party out of the Ukraine, and really hammered some of the organizations to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. Just a completely asymmetrical issue. And I know you've kind of talked about some of that, and I think you're absolutely right. And how we govern it, I think we're here to try to help drive some of the conversations around that. I think this is absolutely a huge benefit to the community. So again, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
One big question for me is, we know the history of third-party risk governance and how it started with checklists and compliance, and then it's moved more into risk-based. But a lot of the industries haven't moved away from a one-and-done assessment for audit purposes, which seems to be foundational. What is your aspect or your perception on what that will look like moving into the future? Will it remain annual, or is annual even the right thing to do?
The simple answer is it's not going to remain annual because annual is insufficient. Now, the more complicated answer is enterprises have to recognize how they deal with software currency within their own environment. And that in of itself is a challenge for any enterprise of scale. So now we have to think about, okay, to the degree that we've been successful at building a more resilient enterprise through good IT hygiene practices that result in software currency, which is what's necessary for certainly the non-Petya, ransomware, even though it wasn't really ransomware, but ransomware data destructive events. It's clear that that's what's IT hygiene is necessary. What's not clear and what represents a significant challenge is how do we influence that in the third-party world? Because a single assessment at a point in time on an annual basis is not designed to determine the continuous effectiveness of IT hygiene controls over a period of time, which is necessary to achieve software currency. So software currency is a challenge in enterprises large and small. Many people assume the smaller the organization, the easier it is, which is not true because in a smaller organization, you're less likely to have an asset inventory management process, certainly not an automated one. And so if you're using a spreadsheet, which is the most common tool that's used for that, it's only as good as the information on that spreadsheet. And the more changes you make to the infrastructure, even if just a dozen devices, the more challenging it is to update that at any point in time. And then you multiply that by a factor of 5 for medium-sized organizations. It's not until you get to a large organization with, I'll just use a number 100,000 devices, that you really invest in the automation and the maturity of IT hygiene at scale. And so most of the third parties that we as an enterprise deal with aren't at that scale. So how do we teach them effective practices and monitor their effectiveness over time in a way that helps them as well as helping us? And we don't have the techniques to do that today, but one cornerstone that all of us, I think, can put a stake in and say it's a given, annual assessments are insufficient to meet that need. So continuous evaluation and assessment is necessary. And so now the question is, how do we design that in a community spirit to make it everyone's best interests to help improve resiliency of the whole ecosystem? And you're starting to do that today, and enterprises are starting to do that today. We need more of that. going forward.
Yeah, so we're in a collaborative approach. I think you touched on this concept with Vinny and Tina, I think it was. So, in that case where Tina thinks she's doing the right thing, you're kind of targeting talent, right? Talent is one of those things where it's, in large organizations, potentially easier to attract, but also hard to come by really, really strong talent. For smaller businesses, even harder, right? Finding those people who really even understand that configuration change even, created a major potential headache for an Aetna or otherwise, right?
You bring up a good point, Jonathan, in that the access to talent is limited in smaller organizations, medium-sized organizations. Absolutely true. I think what we have to rely on is not so much talent, but technique. Technique is the differentiator that can allow us to scale up and down, up to large enterprises, medium, down to medium and small enterprises. Technique is what we have to hang our hat on, I think.
Yeah, and I've heard you speak about this a little bit also on the technique side. So when you think about the techniques that are necessary for this, you talk about collaboration a little bit. Mm-hmm. I know you've been leading the charge around this. Maybe a little bit about what you've seen and what your thoughts are around that as well.
Yeah, so the first principle that resonates with me is whatever control is desired across a community, understand the economic consequences of putting that control in place to all of the entities involved. And what I mean by that is I believe that if you take the total cost of IT ownership for the third party, that good IT hygiene practices through techniques reduce the cost of ownership. So there's economic incentive for the third party to apply the technique. And if that's the case, the chances of fulfilling that technique are greater, exponentially greater, than if it's a burden. If the introduction of the technique and the implementation of the technique becomes an economic burden, that's problematic. And I think we've seen this historically where the economic burden of the control prohibits the wider adoption of the control in third-party governance. And so the design of the technique has to be put in the right economic consequence for the vendor or the third party so that there's incentive rather than disincentive. And that's on the enterprise to design that. And I think it's feasible, possible, practical. None of it happens without community education and awareness. And firms like your firm, that's your sweet spot, is communication and education of the community.
So one of the things that keeps me up at night is the fact that you create that technique and you share it, and the community may or may not take hold of it. What are some of the things that you can do in order to advance the awareness of it?
So it's funny when you said one of the things that keeps you up at night. One of the things that keeps me up at night is if I drink too much fluid before I go to bed. That at my age, those are the things that I worry about. No, it's not
it keeps me. It keeps us all up. Okay. Unfortunately, I think we're in the same boat. Yeah.
It's not a pass.
No, this is an all age thing. Yeah, no, I think we're all there.
But it's actually a pretty good reminder that if you throttle the consumption of liquid at night, you reduce the propensity to wake up in the middle of the night to have to go to the bathroom. So there's a correlation there, and it's actually good for us. But maybe we need reminders, and that's not far off what we deal with in terms of third-party governance. I think often the education of the technique and the reminder of the technique, if it can be put in the context of the entity's self-interest, we have a fighting chance of adhering to it and conforming to it at scale, which is essentially what's necessary. So I'm somewhat of an optimist. I've been doing third-party governance as an enterprise for 15 years, and I don't think I've had tremendous success across that space, yet I remain optimistic that we can design effective controls. And it's one of the reasons that I'm committed to looking for new controls that aren't based on an annual assessment that aren't based necessarily on compliance requirements, but are grounded in effective practices for IT hygiene. And I think it's in the community's best interest to identify both the techniques and the methods for ensuring those techniques are effective. And I think that's feasible, and I remain committed to doing it. And it's why I like working with you guys to do that.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've seen him do in the past at Aetna was adaptive enablement. Can you explain a little bit about that so that people in the community might be able to utilize the same type of technique in driving key performance indicators to get the awareness and the influence out to use a specific way of doing work?
I can. I'm going to have to break into a little bit of history in order to do that. So the history is that all security practitioners share a common origin in which we have a demonstrated track record of adding security and inflicting friction on the user. And we're quite competent at this historically, meaning that when we want to add security, we make it harder for the consumer.
You say
right?
no.
Right, exactly.
You say no? Yep.
Right? Multi-factor authentication, obviously industry standard across all authoritative sources. Well, it's more friction, right? And so we have a track record of instrumenting that, and that same goes through third-party governance for third parties. So I think what we have to recognize is that there are opportunities to reduce friction rather than always increasing friction. And if we think of it, decreasing friction can be a lever that we consciously pull for the right behavior, which would be low-risk behavior. Whereas friction can be another lever that we pull for high-risk behavior. And so the friction is geared towards low-risk behavior, no friction, high-risk behavior, friction. If we pull those two levers and use both of them, we can incent the right behavior. The third component is to measure the outcome of the behavior and share that with 3 levels in any organization. So in the third-party world, let's deal with the enterprise as one level. Let's deal with senior management of the third party as another level. And let's deal with the third level, boots on the ground, the IT stewards of the third party. Now we have 3 levels. So if we share information, of factual information on the net result of the use of the 2 levers in key performance indicators for whatever critical process we determine, and we provide that, essentially the natural laws of what drive an organization take hold over time. And the sustained, what we get is a sustained level of the right behavior, because it's natural for people to try to avoid friction. It's also natural to take advantage of where there's no friction. So the natural tendency, because everybody's just trying to get their job done on a day in, day out basis, is to avoid friction where possible. And where there is friction, recognize that a critical juncture and see if we can avoid it the next time. If we then share that information with 3 levels in the organization, everyone has the same facts. And by using those facts, behavior changes. And it changes not on a 1 week or 1 month basis. It changes over the long term. So it becomes sustainable over long term. So it sounds very simple, but it works in the largest organizations and the smallest organizations. And it works effectively in both.
So would an example of that, I know you've spoken a lot about authentication, being broken, this concept of password management and
actually passwords.
Passwords themselves are right
broken.
And then email security. I know this is a big issue for you as well, where we give people email, and you've spoken about the fact that then we tell people don't trust it, right?
Right.
So these 2 things, would those tie into some of your thoughts around how you're thinking about changing those? to help benefit your users?
Absolutely. So what I want to do is, instead of providing friction for good behavior, which doesn't create a sustainable incentive,
I don't think so.
right? Create friction for bad behavior.
Right.
Eliminate as much friction as possible for good behavior. And in this case, the good behavior of bad behavior is just the application of techniques. So if we can identify techniques that represent good behavior, which is low risk behavior, and enforce those techniques not through the enterprise, but through the third party. And I think we can do that as long as we identify the techniques, make sure that the techniques deployed have economic advantage. And economic advantage in this context is like removing friction, right? It creates natural incentive. And then measure that over time. I think we can achieve that. And I think the control design has to factor in the three-lever approach and factor in the community administration of that, if you will, into the design itself. So it can't, in other words, if I work for a large enterprise and we use techniques for IT hygiene, I can't assume that those exact same techniques are going to work for the smaller enterprise, because maybe we have automation that they don't have. Maybe there's other variables, right? So we have to design the technique in terms of the application of the control in a way that delivers benefit, economic benefit to the third party. And if we don't pass muster on that, three levers don't really matter. So that's kind of the cornerstone that we have to do. And I think there are examples of that where we have done that successfully. And I think we just have to continue to think about it that way.
So as you think about the techniques, you mentioned continuous, assessment and monitoring tied to collaboration, right? These new types of techniques coming together seemingly help solve a lot of the challenges that have forced people into point-in-time assessments that don't work. Frankly, third parties that are overwhelmed with the level of assessment and frankly can't actually get to the work that they have to do, and because they're simply just answering questionnaires. Do you feel like the path is there, that these two things coming together really help address some of those major challenges with a new type of technique?
So I think some things are working in our favor. One is that small organizations, and this is increasing over time, as well as medium and large organizations, have an internet presence in terms of how they do business. And that internet presence creates a public exposure of IT assets that can be measured. And so vulnerabilities and weaknesses and bad IP traffic are all easily measured. It's basically in the public domain. And that creates an opportunity to share real-time data, or as near as real-time as can be. And I can tell you, in a large enterprise, we use that information about ourselves every day to understand what our profile looks like to the external world. And there are things we discover through that means, which perhaps maybe we should be discovering them internally, but we don't. It actually points to things that we're not necessarily covering internally that need attention. And so we have built that into our fabric as an enterprise, where every day we look at what our score is in this continuous assessment model. Now, we're smart enough to know that it doesn't reflect all of the changes in our environment on a daily basis, but it is what the external world will look at any point in time. And it does help direct resource to the highest risk issues. And so it's an example of where it's exposing information in the public to three levels, if you will. And we're responding to that every single day to try to make the perception of what our control maturity is as high as possible day in and day out. Now, that's a healthy thing for an enterprise, large, medium, or small. And so I think continuous assessment has that potential. I think we need to get better at it. I think, frankly, at some point in time, enterprises and in this case, the enterprise I work with today is both a vendor, a third party, as well as an enterprise with third parties. And I know for myself that in our enterprise, we should do a better job of providing information continually to supplement what's available in the public continuous assessment world, and maybe share some of that information to get more precise in the data that we're all, evaluating or certainly looking at and evaluating.
So if there was one technique that you would select as the most important technique for third-party risk governance, which one would that be?
So that depends. Do I sound like a consultant?
They do say that often.
I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe.
How much is that going to cost? It depends.
So it depends on a couple of things. The first, if it's cloud computing usage for a third party, I'm going to kind of have one perspective on that. If it's software currency of a third party's infrastructure, I'm going to have a different perspective on that. And if it's compliance oriented, I'm going to have another perspective on that. So, so those are kind of the variables. But I can tell you for third parties using cloud computing infrastructure today, I believe that the longer term solution might be underwriting the cost, part of the cost of providing the infrastructure as a service in order to have visibility and potentially some control over the configuration. And that is really interesting, but also unprecedented, I think, in many ways, where an enterprise, for the good of a community, is willing to provide infrastructure that shares and exposes information that both the community and the enterprise together use for governing maturation of controls over a period of time. There are examples of that today, a couple of examples, but it's not widespread. And I think actually the enterprise has to take the lead, not the third party taking the lead of sharing that information. I think the enterprise has to take the lead on that one. And again, the industry benefits, third parties benefit, the enterprise benefits, but it's a little bit like playing long ball. It's thinking a little bit more strategic, and it's going to take quite a bit of time because a lot of enterprises today feel that their security is greatly improved the less information they share. And that is actually diametrically opposite from reality. Reality is the more mature your program is, the more information you share because you share information to get your program more mature, right? But a lot of people don't necessarily see that as a means to an end, and they feel that keeping information about their enterprise and their resiliency secret is better protection. And it's never been that way historically, and it's never going to be that way. But it's tough to get to change that level of behavior.
We ran into that with an industry just recently. Remember when we were in a meeting and they were worried about confidentiality if they were to share information, and it's a difficult challenge to help the industry understand that sharing is caring.
Well, these were industry participants who actually we were bringing together collaboratively and showing them information about their industry and looking to move them to kind of the next phase. And, the conversation was tough because they, in a number of cases, said, harder for them to manage. And then, bring security, feel more secure around what they're doing together. So it was an interesting conversation.
What I did like is that they're worried about the medium-sized to lower-sized companies, not the 100-plus Fortune type companies, where they were trying to figure out how can we help those who do not have the funding or the capability to assess their third parties, and what are ways that we can help the community, but yet at the same time let's not share. So
yeah, and
it'll be good.
And this was a group of people that everybody uses. It's a horizontally used industry, not healthcare, but trying to get them to that next phase of thought process around it is interesting. When you look at those types of controls, you envision a future where you do have to change the dynamics around how people think about it, how you secure information that you're offering somebody who normally you wouldn't invest in at all, to your point, where you still have such a responsibility around the information. I love that idea. I would love to investigate that further. What do you think the future holds for third-party risk or third-party governance capabilities?
If we look historically for a moment at third-party governance, the primary sets of controls are embedded in the procurement process, which basically says that the enterprise uses the weight of the wallet for influencing controls. I think that's fundamentally flawed. And I think history has shown that that's fundamentally flawed. It assumes that we can design controls regardless of the economic impact for the third party, simply because the enterprise benefits from that. And the enterprise will enforce those controls where they have the most leverage in terms of their wallet. And if that sounds similar to what's in place today at most infrastructures, it is. And I don't think it's should be the component that we design around going forward. I think the enterprise has to recognize that they have accountability and responsibility to their customer for the entire community. And I think they have to recognize that they have to create control capability that creates economic incentive for the community. And that's their obligation as an enterprise to be successful on behalf of their clients. Now, I didn't say anything about procurement. And in fact, the more we move away from procurement as the process of enforcement, the closer we're going to come to something that's economically viable across the ecosystem. And so that's a fundamental break from the past. It doesn't mean that, well, I'll give you another example of this. And this is, again, based on years and years of scar tissue dealing with third parties. I have significantly greater success influencing a third party when I don't have to deal with terms and conditions in a contract. When I deal with terms and conditions in a contract, it's very, very difficult to engender the level of spirit and cooperation and collaboration that's necessary for community play. So if I can avoid the terms and conditions in the contract, I have a higher success rate in getting compliance to a set of controls that benefit both. So I think the model for third-party governance has to evolve beyond the procurement process, and in some ways be somewhat independent of the procurement process for enforcement, for the good of the community going forward. Radical construct, fundamentally different, but I believe it.
Well, I get asked a lot about that as well. And, the reality is I think they have different missions. The organizations, that focus solely on the procurement piece and potentially inclusive of some legal part of the contract management component has a much different mission than the risk management function itself, right, or the governance function. That's great. Well, as we're wrapping here, you've actually recommended a couple really good books. Algorithms to Live By is one that I really, really enjoyed. You reading anything interesting right now?
Yeah, I'm actually Marshall Goldsmith. I'm reading at the two books I'm reading right now. Top of mind just popped in my mind from what you said. But that's more about leadership and kind of knowing what your core attributes are and how to play to your strengths. We're talking about community controls. But leadership practices have a lot to do with the success rate at driving community controls. Because, for example, we have to lead by demonstrating a different set of behaviors. And that sounds easy, is really hard. As enterprises, we have to walk the talk, and the talk has to be all about the community, which again is 180 degrees from the heavy wallet-driven discussions that we've had in the past. So some of that leadership and communication applies directly to building communal effort, and part of being part of a community is having some level of exposure of your own practices that are part of the community. And I'm ready to do that. And we as an organization are mature enough where we're ready to do that. So we're interested, in how this evolves going forward.
Yeah, that's great. Well, really, really appreciate your time today. This is our first episode, so we're really excited about being able to talk about the types of topics around risk management and security that are really impacting the community at large. And we expect that this is going to be very valuable to everybody that hopefully downloads and listens to it.
Agreed. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and maybe we won't wake up as often in the middle of the night, huh?
I actually didn't drink any water. So you see it's still full. The glass is still half full there, yeah.
Well, one thing they could edit in is one of my favorite book was when Jim gave me When Smart People Fail. And that's indicative of when you're innovating and you're creating and you're trying new things and being leading edge, it's fail fast and fail forward. And so that book was my favorite that you had recommended.
Well, that's such an interesting topic, too. I mean, we're seeing that bear right now, right? So we go to a path, we have to modify this. Obviously, we're working together with the NHISAC and CyberFit and these things that are coming together to really help drive the industry and really making sure that we're flexible to the needs of the whole community as that happens. And I think that's been a real hallmark for not only your leadership there, but also the things that you expect of your partners and making sure that we're delivering into that. So I'm going to read, that's my next one.
It's good.
I'm going to read that one.
I have it. I'll bring it to you.
All right, perfect.
Yeah, we need to demonstrate the competency to acknowledge failure. And, we learn together what works in certain market segments doesn't work in other market segments. The whole communication has to change from that. Well, that, as you pointed out, Brenda, that's failing fast and acknowledging the failure so that you can say, oh, we have a problem. Let's do something different to have a different outcome.
Yeah, that's huge. Jim, thank you so much for joining us here for the first episode of Prevalent's Risk Governance podcast, and appreciate you joining us today.
Hey, I'm happy to be here, Jonathan.
Thank you for listening to the Prevalent Risk Governance podcast. Connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, and visit us at prevalent.net. You can also rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts.